Hey there. Welcome to tonight's journey into the darkness. I know many of you use these stories to drift off to sleep, so before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy what we do here. Also, I'd love to know, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. It always amazes me to see our little community scattered across the globe, all gathered here in the dark together. Now, I want you to get comfortable. Dim the lights, settle into your blankets, let the world outside fade away. Tonight, I have 6 stories for you, tales that will slip into the quiet spaces of your mind and linger there long after the telling is done. Stories about the things we bury, the lies we tell ourselves, and the prices we pay for the choices we make. So take a deep breath. Let yourself sink into the darkness. And let's begin. Story 1. The photography studio smelled like chemicals and dust, a scent that had seeped into the walls over 37 years until it became indistinguishable from the building itself. Marcus Webb stood in the red-lit darkness of his developing room, watching images emerge from blankness like ghosts materializing in fog. This was the part he loved most, the revelation, the moment when invisible became visible, when what the eye had seen but the mind had not yet processed finally took form. The photograph sliding into focus showed the Hendricks family. Mother, father, 2 daughters arranged on his studio's vintage velvet settee. Standard portrait work, the bread and butter that kept his small business alive in an age when everyone carried cameras in their pockets. But something about this image made Marcus lean closer, his practiced eye catching a detail that shouldn't exist. Behind the family, just visible in the background blur, stood a 5th figure, a woman in old-fashioned dress, her features indistinct, but her posture suggesting she was watching the Hendricks with an intensity that bordered on predatory. Marcus's first thought was contamination, a double exposure perhaps, or light leak in the camera. But he'd shot this session himself yesterday afternoon, and he knew with absolute certainty that no one else had been in the studio. He developed the remaining exposures from the session with growing unease. The figure appeared in every frame, always in the background, always watching. In one image, she seemed closer to the family than before. In another, her face had turned slightly toward the camera, though her features remained frustratingly unclear, as if the film itself refused to fully capture her. Marcus had been a photographer for nearly 4 decades. He'd documented weddings and funerals, births and deaths, the full spectrum of human experience filtered through his lenses. He'd seen optical illusions and processing errors, tricks of light and shadow that created phantom images. This was none of those things. This was something else entirely. Something that made his hand shake as he hung the prints to dry. The studio had been his father's before him, passed down like a family curse disguised as inheritance. His father had been a portrait photographer too, known throughout 3 counties for his ability to capture not just faces but essences, the invisible qualities that made each person unique. The camera sees what we refuse to acknowledge, his father had told him countless times. It's honest in ways humans can never be. Marcus left the dark room and climbed the narrow stairs to his apartment above the studio. The building was old, constructed in 1887 according to the brass plate by the front door, and it settled and groaned with the particular vocabulary of aged structures. He'd grown accustomed to its sounds over the decades, could distinguish between benign creaks and those that suggested structural concern. Tonight, the building felt different, more alert somehow, as if it were listening to him, as intently as he listened to it. His apartment was small but sufficient. a bedroom, a kitchenette, a bathroom with pipes that sang when the water ran. The living space was dominated by photographs, his own work and his father's, generations of faces staring from frames that covered every wall. Weddings and graduations, babies and elderly couples marking anniversaries. The accumulated visual history of a small town, all filtered through the Webb family's lenses. Marcus heated soup he didn't taste and tried to rationalize what he'd seen. Perhaps it was time to retire, to admit that age was affecting his judgment. He was 63 now, old enough that his hands occasionally trembled, that his eyes required stronger reading glasses each year. Maybe he'd simply imagined the figure, constructed it from shadows and grain and his own fatigue. But when he returned to the dark room after dinner, the figure remained in every print. And now, examining them with fresh eyes and better lighting, he could see more details. The woman wore a dress from the 1920s, he estimated. Drop waist, beaded detail, the kind of formal attire his grandmother's generation had favored. Her hair was styled in finger waves, and though her face remained unclear, something about her posture suggested youth, perhaps mid-20s. More troubling was what he noticed about her positioning relative to the Hendricks family. In the first exposure, she stood perhaps 10 feet behind them. In the second, maybe 8 feet. By the final frame, she appeared close enough to touch Mrs. Hendricks's shoulder, though the living woman showed no awareness of the presence behind her. Marcus's phone rang, startling him badly enough that he knocked over his coffee mug. The caller was Sarah Hendricks, right on schedule. He'd told her the portraits would be ready for viewing tomorrow, and she was the type to confirm appointments obsessively. Mr. Webb, I just wanted to make sure we're still on for 10 o'clock. Her voice carried the particular anxiety of mothers who've corralled their families for formal photography, an event that always proved more stressful than anticipated. Yes, of course, Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. The images turned out beautifully. I think you'll be very pleased. I'm so glad. The girls were actually cooperative for once. That's rare enough to document. She laughed, the sound bright and uncomplicated. We're planning to use them for our Christmas cards. I can't wait to see how they turned out. Marcus looked at the prints hanging before him, at the spectral woman growing progressively closer to Sarah's family. Mrs. Hendricks, have you ever noticed anything unusual in your home? Any presences or feelings that someone might be watching? The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Marcus wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Sarah spoke. Her voice changed, flattened by something that might have been fear or might simply have been confusion. Why would you ask that? No particular reason. Sometimes cameras pick up things our eyes miss. Reflections, shadows, that sort of thing. I just want to make sure the images don't contain anything that might be upsetting. Another pause. Then, Mr. Webb, my grandmother died in our house 3 months ago. She'd been living with us for the past 2 years after her dementia got too severe for independent living. The girls were very close to her, especially Emma, our youngest. Is there something in the photographs I should know about? Marcus's mouth went dry. What did your grandmother look like? She was small, delicate. Even at 91, she had this elegant quality about her. She'd been a flapper in her youth, according to family stories, used to scandalize her parents with her modern ways. Sarah's voice grew softer. Why, Mr. Webb? What did you see? He could lie, should lie, tell her everything was fine, and present her with portraits that would only disturb. Or he could tell her the truth and watch the comfortable reality she inhabited crack open to reveal the impossible underneath. "I need you to come to the studio tonight," he said. "Bring your husband. There's something you need to see, and I don't want you to see it alone." They arrived within the hour, curiosity and concern drawing them back across town to Marcus's studio. He'd left the darkroom prints hanging, arranged chronologically so the progression was clear. When Sarah saw them, she made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp, wasn't quite a sob. "That's her," she whispered. "That's Grandma Helen. That's exactly how she looked in her wedding photograph from 1952. But that's impossible. She was 91 when she died. She barely weighed 80 pounds. Her mind was gone. How could she?" She gestured helplessly at the figure in the prints, at the young woman watching her family with such intensity. Thomas Hendricks, a practical man who sold insurance and believed in spreadsheets more than speculation, examined each print with methodical attention. There has to be a rational explanation, double exposure maybe, or something wrong with the camera. "I've been a photographer for 37 years, Marcus said quietly. "I know every way an image can be corrupted or contaminated. This isn't that." Sarah was still staring at the photographs, her eyes moving from frame to frame, tracking her grandmother's progressive approach toward her family. "She's getting closer. In each picture, she's closer to us. What does that mean?" Marcus had been considering this question since first noticing the pattern. "I think she's trying to reach you, or protect you, or warn you about something." "Warn us? About what?" Thomas's voice carried the aggressive certainty of someone whose world was being challenged by forces he couldn't control or quantify. "I don't know, but I think we need to find out." Marcus retrieved a folder from his filing cabinet, one he'd inherited from his father and had hoped never to need. Inside were yellowed newspaper clippings and handwritten notes in his father's precise script. My father documented similar phenomena over the years. Unexplained figures and photographs, always connected to recent deaths, always positioned near living family members. He developed a theory. Sarah took the folder with trembling hands, scanning the old clippings. This article is from 1963. Local photographer captures image of deceased man in family portrait. And this one from 1978. "Mr. Webb, why didn't anyone know about this?" "Because my father showed the original photographs to only 3 families over 40 years. Each time, the response was the same. Denial, anger, accusations of manipulation. So he stopped showing them. But he kept taking them, kept documenting what his cameras revealed. He believed the dead sometimes linger, especially when they have unfinished business with the living." Thomas was shaking his head. "This is insane. You're telling us my wife's grandmother is haunting our family photographs because she has unfinished business. This is exactly the kind of nonsense that—" "Tom," Sarah's voice cut through her husband's objection. "Look at this." She was pointing at the final photograph, the one where Helen appeared closest to the family. "Look at her hand. What is she pointing at?" Marcus leaned in, examining details he hadn't noticed before. Sarah was right. The spectral grandmother's hand was extended, one finger pointing not at the family, but at something beyond the camera's frame, something in the studio itself. "She's pointing toward the corner," Marcus said slowly. "Where I keep the old equipment, storage." They moved as a unit, leaving the dark room and entering the main studio space. Marcus flipped on the overhead lights, flooding the room with a harsh fluorescence that eliminated every shadow. The corner Helen had been pointing toward contained metal shelving units stacked with camera equipment his father had used, ancient technology that Marcus had never quite brought himself to discard. "I don't understand what we're looking for," Thomas said, his skepticism wavering in the face of his wife's obvious distress. Sarah was already pulling boxes from shelves, moving with the purposeful determination of someone following intuition over logic. Grandma Helen was trying to tell us something in those photographs. She was pointing here. There must be. She stopped, her hand frozen on a shoebox tucked behind an old bellows camera. "This box. It has my maiden name on it, Henderson. Why would there be a box with my family name in Mr. Webb's storage?" Marcus had no answer. He'd never systematically cataloged his father's accumulated possessions, had simply maintained the studio as it had existed when his father died 15 years ago. Sarah opened the box, carefully, as if expecting something alive to emerge. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all portraits of the Henderson family spanning decades. There were images of Sarah's mother as a young woman, her grandfather in military uniform, her great-grandparents posed formally in sepia tones, and with them, letters. Sarah withdrew the first envelope with shaking hands. The letter was addressed to Marcus's father, dated April 1979, written in Helen Henderson's elegant script. Sarah read aloud, "Dear Robert, thank you for agreeing to keep these photographs and letters safe. My family must never know about James, about the choice I made, about the child I gave up to protect my marriage and my reputation. But someday, perhaps the truth should be known. I'm trusting you to decide when that time comes." The silence that followed was profound and terrible. Sarah opened the remaining envelopes, finding letters that told a story of secrets and sacrifice. Helen Henderson had, in 1951, given birth to a son fathered by a man who was not her husband. She'd surrendered the baby for adoption, had married her intended suitor weeks later, and had carried the secret for more than 60 years. The child, James, had died in 1998, according to one of the later letters. He'd never known his birth mother's name. He'd died believing he'd been unwanted rather than sacrificed to preserve appearances in an era that punished women for moral lapses. "She wanted us to know," Sarah whispered. "All these years, she carried this guilt. And when the dementia took her mind, when she couldn't speak or write anymore, she found another way. She came back to make sure we found these letters, to make sure James wasn't forgotten." Marcus felt something shift in the studio, a change in atmosphere so subtle he might have imagined it. But he didn't think he was imagining it. The weight that had settled over the space since he developed those photographs had lifted, leaving behind something that felt almost like relief. "I think she can rest now," he said quietly. "I think that's all she wanted. For someone to know, to acknowledge what happened to her, to witness her truth." They took the letters and the photographs, Sarah clutching them like sacred relics. After they left, Marcus returned to the dark room and examined the prints one final time. The figure was still there, still visible in every frame, but something about her posture had changed. Where before she'd seemed tense, reaching, now she appeared more relaxed, her hand no longer pointing but simply resting at her side. In the final print, if he squinted just right, he could almost convince himself she was smiling. Marcus kept the photographs, adding them to his father's collection of unexplained images. Over the following weeks, he documented 3 more sessions where spectral figures appeared in backgrounds, always connected to recent deaths, always trying to communicate something to the living subjects. He developed a reputation, though he never advertised it, as the photographer who could capture what others missed, who could make visible the invisible presences that lingered at the edges of our world. His father had been right. The camera saw what humans refused to acknowledge. It was honest in ways people could never be. And sometimes that honesty was exactly what the dead required to finally mercifully let go. Story 2. The sleep study clinic occupied the third floor of a medical building that had been constructed during a brief period in the 1970s, when architects believed brutalism represented humanity's future. Dr. Ellen Vasquez had worked there for 6 years, and she'd never quite grown comfortable with the building's oppressive concrete geometries, the way its narrow windows seemed designed to exclude rather than welcome light. But the work was important, and the facility's equipment was state-of-the-art, so she tolerated the aesthetic assault. Tonight's patient was a referral from Dr. Morrison, a colleague Ellen respected for his thoroughness and his reluctance to medicate without ruling out physiological causes. The patient, Marcus Wren, age 42, had been experiencing sleep disturbances for the past 8 months. Not insomnia exactly, but something Morrison described as parasomnic episodes with unusual narrative consistency. Ellen had read the intake notes with growing interest. Wren reported dreaming the same dream every night without variation, a complete coherent narrative that played out in his mind with the detail and structure of a film, lasting from the moment he achieved the REM sleep until his alarm woke him. Most people don't remember their dreams in that kind of detail, Ellen said as she attached the electrodes to Marcus's head, chest, and legs. The polysomnography equipment would track his brain waves, eye movements, heart rate, breathing, and blood oxygen levels throughout the night. Even recurrent dreams usually have variations, inconsistencies. The mind doesn't typically function like a recording device. Marcus sat very still on the medical bed, his eyes fixed on the monitoring equipment. I'm aware my situation is unusual. That's why Dr. Morrison sent me to you. He thought it might be temporal lobe epilepsy or some other neurological issue manifesting as hyper-realistic dreaming. It's possible. We'll know more after tonight. Ellen adjusted the sensor on his forehead, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. Have the dreams been affecting your daily functioning? I'm exhausted all the time, even though I'm sleeping a full 8 hours. It's like the dreaming is more tiring than being awake. And the content. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. The dream is disturbing, not in a nightmarish way, but disturbing because of how real it feels. When I wake up, I'm not relieved that it was just a dream. I'm confused about which state is real, sleeping or waking. Ellen made notes in his chart recognizing the pattern. Dissociative symptoms, reality testing impairment, could indicate several conditions, some neurological, some psychiatric, some existing in the murky overlap between the two disciplines. Can you describe the dream for me? Marcus's expression shifted, becoming more animated despite his obvious fatigue. I'm living a different life. I have a different name, David Chen. I'm a marine biologist working at a research station in Alaska, studying temperature changes in coastal waters. The dream starts when I wake up in my bunk at the station, and it continues through the entire day. Meals, conversations with colleagues, data collection, everything. Then I go to sleep in the dream, and that's when I wake up here, in my actual life. And this plays out identically every night. Every single night. Same conversations, same data on the computer screens, same meals in the cafeteria. It's like living the same day over and over, except it only exists when I'm asleep. Ellen tried to maintain professional neutrality, but her fascination was growing. Have you noticed any correlation between events in your waking life and the dream content? Stress at work translating into problems at the dream research station, for example. That's the strange part. There's no correlation at all. My waking life and my dream life exist completely independently. David Chen's problems have nothing to do with Marcus Wren's problems. They're separate people living separate lives in separate realities, and I'm somehow experiencing both. After settling Marcus in for the night, Ellen returned to the monitoring station where banks of screens displayed the data flowing from his attached sensors. Her night shift technician, Raymond, was already at his post, adjusting baseline readings and ensuring the equipment functioned properly. "Interesting case," he asked, noting the additional notation she'd made in the patient's file. "Potentially. Recurrent dream with unusual consistency and detail. Could be seizure activity. Could be psychiatric. Could be something I haven't seen before." "Those are always the best ones," Raymond said with the enthusiasm of someone who'd worked night shifts for 15 years and still found human neurological mysteries exciting rather than exhausting. Marcus fell asleep within 20 minutes, transitioning smoothly through the sleep stages Ellen expected. His brain activity looked perfectly normal during the N1 and N2 phases, showing the characteristic patterns of healthy adult sleep. But when he entered REM sleep approximately 90 minutes after going under, something changed. His brainwave patterns were consistent with REM, the low amplitude, mixed frequency activity typical of dreaming. But they displayed an unusual regularity, a rhythmic consistency that Ellen had never observed before. "Raymond, are you seeing this?" The technician leaned closer to his screen. "That's weird. It's like his REM activity is organized, like there's a structure to it instead of the normal scattered pattern." Ellen pulled up comparison data from other patients confirming her observation. Normal REM sleep showed varied, unpredictable brain activity as the mind processed information, consolidated memories, and generated the bizarre narratives humans call dreams. Marcus's REM patterns were different, repetitive, almost mechanical in their consistency. "It's like watching a recording play," she murmured. Over the next 2 hours, Ellen documented patterns she couldn't explain. Marcus's physiological responses during REM sleep were perfectly synchronized with his brain activity, as if his body was experiencing his dream with complete verisimilitude. When his heart rate increased, his brain activity suggested he was experiencing stress in the dream. When his breathing deepened and slowed, his neural patterns indicated relaxation. There was no disconnect between his mental and physical states, no gap between what his mind experienced and what his body responded to. At 4:27 a.m., something unprecedented occurred. Marcus's brain activity spiked dramatically, showing patterns that suggested not sleep, but full waking consciousness. Yet his eyes remained closed, his body still, his other vital signs consistent with continued sleep. On the monitor, his brain was lighting up in ways that indicated active processing, decision-making, sensory integration, all the hallmarks of conscious awareness, while his body remained deeply asleep. "This doesn't make sense," Raymond said, checking the equipment connections to rule out technical malfunction. "He's simultaneously asleep and awake. That's not supposed to be possible." Ellen called Dr. Morrison despite the early hour. The neurologist arrived within 30 minutes, still wearing the sweatpants he'd hastily pulled on when his phone rang. Together, they watched Marcus's brain activity continue its impossible dual state, sleeping and waking, unconscious and aware, existing in two states that should have been mutually exclusive. I need to wake him, Ellen said. If this is a seizure, we need to intervene. Wait. Morrison was studying the monitors with intense focus. Look at the pattern. If this were seizure activity, we'd see disruption, chaos. But this is organized. It's like he's running two separate neurological programs simultaneously. At 5:43 a.m., Marcus's alarm sounded in his assigned room. His eyes opened, his body stretched. He sat up and began removing the sensor leads with the calm efficiency of someone fully oriented to reality. Ellen entered the room carefully, assessing his mental state. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Marcus said, rubbing his eyes. "More tired than when I went to sleep." "Did you get useful data?" "Very unusual data, yes." "Marcus, I need to ask you something. In your dream, in David Chen's life, what time did you go to sleep last night?" He thought about it, clearly calling up specific memories from the dream narrative. "Around 11:30. Why?" Ellen pulled up the timeline from the monitoring station. "Because at exactly 11:30, your brain activity changed dramatically. For the rest of the night, your neural patterns suggested you were simultaneously dreaming and conscious. It's as if you were fully awake in one reality while your physical body remained asleep in this one." Marcus stared at her, his expression shifting from confusion to something that looked almost like fear. "That's not possible." "That's what we thought too. But the data is clear. For approximately 6 hours last night, you were living two separate conscious experiences simultaneously. One here, asleep in our clinic, and one in your dream world, fully awake and aware, as David Chen." Dr. Morrison stepped forward. "Marcus, I need you to consider a disturbing possibility. What if this isn't a dream at all? What if you're somehow experiencing two distinct realities, two versions of consciousness, two separate lives that both exist simultaneously?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Ellen watched Marcus process the implications, saw the exact moment when academic curiosity gave way to existential terror. "If that's true," Marcus said slowly, "then which one is real? Am I Marcus Wren who dreams he's David Chen, or am I David Chen who dreams he's Marcus Wren? How do I know which life is the dream and which is reality?" Ellen had no answer. The data suggested something that challenged every assumption about consciousness, about the nature of sleep and waking, about the boundaries between self and other. "We need to run more tests," she said, falling back on professional protocol because what else could she offer? Brain scans, neurological workups, psychiatric evaluation. We need to understand what's happening to you. Over the following weeks, Marcus underwent extensive testing. MRI scans showed no abnormalities in his brain structure. EEG monitoring continued to reveal the same impossible pattern: dual consciousness during REM sleep, simultaneous awareness in two distinct realities. Psychiatric evaluation found him mentally healthy, oriented, showing no signs of dissociative disorder or psychotic break. Whatever was happening to Marcus Wren, it didn't fit any existing diagnostic category. "I've been doing research," Marcus told Ellen during their 5th monitoring session. "There are theoretical frameworks in physics and philosophy that might explain this. Quantum consciousness theories suggest that awareness might not be bound to a single timeline or reality. The many worlds interpretation proposes infinite parallel universes splitting off from every quantum event. What if I'm somehow conscious in two of those universes simultaneously?" "That's extremely speculative," Ellen said carefully, though privately she'd been exploring similar ideas. Science had no framework for what Marcus was experiencing. Perhaps philosophy and physics offered better tools for understanding. "I've been testing it," Marcus continued. conducting experiments to see if David Chen's reality follows consistent rules, if it has permanence and continuity beyond what I can directly observe. And it does. Last week, I left a note for a colleague in the dream, a reminder about a meeting. The next night, when I returned to that reality, the colleague referenced our meeting. The note had persisted. The world continues to exist even when I'm not conscious in it. Ellen felt a chill run down her spine. What you're describing isn't dreaming. Dreams don't have that kind of consistency and continuity. Exactly. Which means either I'm experiencing a complete psychotic break that's somehow escaping detection by every diagnostic tool modern medicine possesses, or... He trailed off, the implication too large to speak. Or you're actually living two lives, Ellen finished. Two genuine, legitimate existences in different realities, somehow maintaining consciousness in both simultaneously when you sleep. The question is what happens when one of me dies, Marcus said quietly. If David Chen's body dies in that reality, does Marcus Wren wake up and simply stop dreaming? Or does Marcus Wren die too, because we're fundamentally the same consciousness experiencing two vessels? And if Marcus Wren dies, does David Chen just stop falling asleep, living perpetually in a single unbroken stream of consciousness? Ellen had no answers, only more questions. She published her findings in a neurological journal, carefully anonymizing Marcus's identity but documenting the unprecedented patterns of dual consciousness she'd observed. The paper was met with skepticism and fascination in equal measure. Some colleagues dismissed it as elaborate hoax or equipment malfunction. Others began searching their own data for similar patterns, wondering how many patients might be living double lives without anyone realizing it. Marcus stopped coming to the clinic eventually. He'd gotten his answer. He wasn't sick, wasn't broken, just profoundly unusual in ways that medicine couldn't address. I've learned to accept it, he told Ellen during their final session. I have two lives, two sets of relationships, two careers, two versions of myself. It's exhausting and sometimes confusing, but it's my reality. Or realities, I suppose. Are you happy? Ellen asked, realizing it was perhaps the most important question she'd failed to ask before. Marcus considered this carefully. I'm not sure happiness is the right word. I'm complete. In each reality, the other one feels like something missing, a phantom limb I can sense, but not touch. Together they make a whole person. Alone, each is just half of something larger. So yes, I think I'm happy. Or at least, I'm as happy as someone can be, while existing in multiple states simultaneously. After he left, Ellen sat in her monitoring station, looking at the screens that had revealed Marcus's impossible condition. She thought about consciousness and reality, about the assumptions we make regarding the nature of existence. We believe we're singular beings living linear lives in one concrete reality. But what if that's just a comforting story we tell ourselves? What if consciousness is more fluid, more multiple, more strange than our limited perspective allows us to perceive? She never saw Marcus Wren again, but sometimes late at night when monitoring other patients' dreams, she wondered if somewhere in a research station in Alaska, a marine biologist named David Chen was falling asleep and waking up as someone else entirely. And she wondered which version was having the stranger dream, the man who slept and became Marcus, or the man who slept and became David. Perhaps, she thought, the question itself was meaningless. Perhaps both lives were equally real, equally valid, equally worthy of being lived. And perhaps the only difference between Marcus Wren and everyone else was that he was brave enough to acknowledge what the rest of us refused to consider. That reality might be far more flexible, far more multiple, far more beautifully strange than we ever dared imagine. The monitors hummed softly in the darkness, tracking the dreams of ordinary people living ordinary singular lives. Or so she assumed. But after Marcus, Ellen was no longer certain of anything, and in the uncertainty she found not fear but wonder. The profound, unsettling, exhilarating recognition that the universe was larger and stranger and more full of possibilities than our small minds could comprehend. Story 3. The antique mall occupied a converted textile factory on the outskirts of Portland. 3 floors of individual vendor stalls selling everything from Victorian furniture to mid-century kitchenware. Claire Hartwell had been running Booth 47 for 8 years, specializing in vintage clothing and accessories from the 1920s through 1960s. She knew her inventory intimately, could date a piece by its construction and identify makers by their signature details. She prided herself on authentication, on never misleading customers about an item's true age or origin, which made the dress's appearance in her booth both fascinating and deeply troubling. Claire discovered it on a Wednesday morning, hanging on the rack between a beaded flapper dress she'd acquired at an estate sale and a 1950s circle skirt with hand-embroidered poodles. The new dress was extraordinary black silk with intricate lace overlay, clearly from the late Victorian era, perhaps 1890s based on the sleeve construction and waist placement. The condition was remarkable, as if it had been preserved in a time capsule rather than worn and aged like most surviving garments from that period. But Claire hadn't put it there. She was certain of that. She'd closed her booth at 6 p.m. Tuesday evening, had personally locked the display case, and set the security alarm. The mall's owner confirmed that no alarms had triggered overnight. No security footage showed anyone entering her space. Yet here was the dress, hanging as naturally as if it had always been there, as if it had materialized from the air itself. Claire examined the garment carefully, searching for tags, labels, maker's marks, anything that might indicate its origin. Nothing. The stitching was hand-done, the fabric a quality of silk that suggested considerable expense. The lace was real Chantilly, she estimated, worth a small fortune even in damaged condition. This dress represented thousands of dollars in materials alone, not counting the hundreds of hours required to construct it. No one simply left something so valuable in a stranger's booth without explanation. She called Margaret, who managed booth 19 and had been at the mall longer than anyone. "Has anyone been asking about my space? Looking to consign something or drop off items?" Margaret's response was immediate and concerned. "Nothing like that. Why?" Claire described the dress, its mysterious appearance, its extraordinary quality. Margaret was silent for a long moment. "Claire, this is probably going to sound strange, but I need you to look at the hem. Tell me if there's anything unusual about it." The request was odd, but Claire complied, lifting the dress to examine its lower edge. The hem was beautifully finished, tiny stitches invisible to casual observation. But as she looked closer, she saw something that made her breath catch. Embroidered in thread so fine it was nearly invisible were words. "Find me, help me, Abigail Crane, 1894. "Claire?" Margaret's voice came through the phone. "Did you find something? There's an embroidered message, a name and date, 1894. Margaret, what is this?" "It's not the first time," Margaret said quietly. "Over the years, certain vendors have reported items appearing in their booths overnight. Always connected to deaths, to people who died with unfinished business or unreported crimes. The building knows things, Claire. It remembers, and sometimes it tries to tell us. The explanation should have sounded insane. Claire was a rational person, a businesswoman who dealt in facts and provenance and documented history. She didn't believe in haunted buildings or objects that appeared mysteriously, in messages from the dead embroidered into fabric. But the dress was real, hanging in front of her, carrying a plea from someone named Abigail Crane, who'd apparently died more than a century ago. Claire spent her lunch break researching. Abigail Crane turned out to be surprisingly easy to find in historical records. She'd been a young woman from a wealthy Portland family, engaged to be married to a prominent businessman named Theodore Whitmore. She disappeared in October 1894, 3 weeks before her scheduled wedding. The newspaper accounts described it as a tragic mystery, a young woman of excellent character and substantial prospects vanishing without trace or explanation. The case had never been solved. Eventually, the assumption settled into fact. Abigail Crane had fled her engagement, run away to start a new life elsewhere, abandoned her family and social standing for reasons known only to herself. But the dress told a different story. Find me, help me, not the words of someone who'd chosen to leave, but of someone who'd been taken, silenced, erased. Claire looked at the garment with new eyes, seeing not just a beautiful object, but evidence of a crime that had gone undiscovered for more than 100 years. She called the local historical society, reaching a researcher named Dr. Susan Park, who specialized in Portland's Victorian era. "I have a dress that might be connected to a missing person case from 1894, Claire explained, feeling absurd even as she spoke. "Abigail Crane. Do you know anything about her?" Dr. Park's response was immediate and intense. "Abigail Crane is one of my ongoing research interests. She disappeared from her family's home the night before a planned dress fitting for her wedding gown. She was never seen again. What kind of dress do you have?" "Black silk with lace overlay. Victorian construction, very high quality. Late 1880s or early 1890s based on the styling." "Mourning dress," Dr. Park said immediately. "Women of that era wore black for extended periods after deaths in their families. Do you have any provenance for the piece?" Claire hesitated. "Not exactly, but there's an embroidered message asking for help. It includes her name and the year 1894. The silence stretched long enough that Claire checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Dr. Park spoke. Her voice changed, charged with something between excitement and dread. "I need to see that dress. Today, if possible." They met at the antique mall an hour later. Dr. Park examined the garment with the reverence of someone handling a sacred relic, photographing every detail, documenting the stitching, the fabric, the nearly invisible message worked into the hem. "This is remarkable," she said finally. "If this is genuine, and I have no reason to doubt it is, this represents a direct communication from Abigail Crane herself. She made this dress knowing she was in danger, embroidered a message for someone to find in the future. But why a mourning dress? Who was she mourning?" The question hung in the air between them. Claire found herself thinking about the dress's placement in her booth, the deliberate way it had appeared between the flapper dress and the poodle skirt, as if guiding her attention, asking her specifically notice it. "Is there any connection between Abigail and this building?" she asked. "Any reason her dress would appear here specifically?" Dr. Park pulled up records on her tablet. "The building has housed multiple businesses over the decades. Before it was an antique mall, it was a warehouse. Before that, it was the original factory. Portland textile mill, operating from 1889 to 1947. The owner was, she paused, her eyes widening. The owner was Theodore Whitmore, Abigail's fiancé. Understanding clicked into place with the weight of revelation. She worked here, or came here. This place was significant to whatever happened to her. Dr. Park was already pulling up more records, cross-referencing dates and names. Theodore Whitmore was 37 when he became engaged to Abigail, who was 19. Their engagement was arranged by their families, his money and her social standing, a typical transaction of the era. But there were rumors about Whitmore, whispered suggestions that he had a temper, that his first wife's death might not have been the accident everyone assumed. Nothing was ever proven, and in 1894, women's testimony was often dismissed if it conflicted with men's interests. You think he killed her? I think Abigail discovered something about him, something that made her afraid. And I think she tried to protect herself by creating evidence, by documenting her fear in the only way available to her, through needlework, through domestic arts that were invisible to men of her era. She embroidered her fear into fabric, hoping someone would eventually find it and understand. Claire looked at the dress with new comprehension. But where is she? If he killed her, where's the body? Dr. Park's expression was grim. Theodore Whitmore owned this building. If he wanted to hide something permanently, he had access to walls, foundations, floors that could be sealed and forgotten. She could be anywhere in this structure. They brought in ground-penetrating radar the following week, scanning the building's oldest sections for anomalies that might indicate disturbed Earth or hidden spaces. The technology revealed what historical records had not. A sealed room in the basement, walled off with newer brick that dated to the early 1900s, hidden behind what appeared to be original foundation work. The police obtained a warrant. The sealed room was opened, and Abigail Crane was found. She'd been walled in alive, they determined from the positioning of her remains. Her hands had clawed at the bricks, her fingers broken in her desperate attempt to escape. She'd been wearing a mourning dress, though she'd had no recent deaths in her family to mourn. She'd been mourning herself, Claire realized, mourning the life she knew she was about to lose, the future that would be stolen from her by a man who viewed women as possessions to be controlled or destroyed. The discovery made national news. Abigail Crane's story was finally told. Her disappearance reclassified as murder. Her truth acknowledged more than a century after her death. Theodore Whitmore's reputation was posthumously destroyed, his letters and journals revealing a man of profound cruelty and entitlement. He'd killed her when she'd tried to end their engagement, had sealed her in the basement of his factory, and had told everyone she'd run away to shame him. He'd lived another 40 years, dying wealthy and respected, never once held accountable for what he'd done. Claire returned the dress to the Historical Society, where it was preserved as evidence of Abigail's attempt to bear witness to her own murder. But before she released it, she examined the embroidery one final time, those tiny stitches forming words that had waited 127 years to be read. Find me, help me. And finally someone had. After Abigail's remains were properly buried and her story told, the building felt different. Claire couldn't quite articulate the change, but other vendors noticed it too. A lightness, a sense of something released. The mall's old corners felt less oppressive. The shadows seemed less heavy. It was as if the building itself had been holding its breath, waiting for truth to be spoken, and could finally exhale. Margaret stopped by booth 47 a month after the discovery. Has anything else appeared mysteriously? Nothing, Claire said. Why? Because there are probably others. Other people who died in silence, whose stories need telling, whose evidence is hidden in objects we haven't recognized yet. This building has seen 130 years of human life, human tragedy, human secrets. Abigail was just one. There will be more. Claire thought about this, about the responsibility that came with paying attention, with being willing to see what others overlooked or dismissed. Then we'll keep watching, she said. We'll keep listening, and if the building tries to tell us something else, we'll believe it. Because that was the lesson Abigail Crane had taught her, that the past is never fully buried, that truth has a way of surfacing even through brick and stone and the deliberate forgetting of history. Objects remember, buildings remember, and sometimes, if we're paying attention, they share their memories with us, asking only that we listen, believe, and bear witness to the stories that were silenced but never truly lost. Story 4. The call came at 2:47 a.m., pulling Detective Sarah Vance from the thin, unsatisfying sleep that was all she seemed capable of these days. 23 years on the force, the last 8 in homicide, and she'd never quite mastered the art of disconnecting from work when she went home. The cases followed her into sleep, populated her dreams with faces and questions that had no easy answers. Vance, she answered, her voice hoarse with interrupted rest. Detective, we've got something downtown. Warehouse district near the old shipping docks. You're going to want to see this. Dispatch sounded shaken, which immediately elevated Sarah's concern. Dispatch had heard everything, had become professionally detached from horror through exposure. For them to sound disturbed meant something exceptional had happened. The warehouse was from the 1940s, one of dozens that had been slowly converting to artist lofts and microbreweries as Portland's industrial core gentrified. This particular building remained unconverted, too damaged by time and weather to be economically viable for residential development. It stood alone on its block, surrounded by construction barriers and signs warning about structural instability. Inside, Sarah found a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her career. 7 bodies, arranged in a precise circle in the building's main floor. All were seated in matching wooden chairs, their hands folded in their laps, their heads tilted back at identical angles. The positioning was so artificial, so deliberately theatrical, that it took her mind several seconds to accept what she was seeing as real corpses rather than mannequins posed for some macabre art installation. None of them have been dead long, the medical examiner said, already at work documenting the scene. Based on lividity and temperature, I'd estimate time of death within the last 4 to 6 hours. But the cause, she gestured helplessly at the bodies. I don't see any trauma, no wounds, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate how they died. Sarah moved closer, careful not to disturb potential evidence. The victims were varied, men and women ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s, representing different races and apparent socio-economic backgrounds. They wore ordinary clothes, jeans, t-shirts, business casual attire, nothing that suggested they'd known they were going to die tonight. Their expressions were neutral, almost peaceful, as if they'd simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Do we have IDs? Working on it. No wallets or phones on any of them, but we're running fingerprints. Should have names within the hour. Sarah noticed something she'd initially missed. The floor beneath the circle of chairs was marked with chalk, intricate symbols and text forming a larger pattern that encompassed all 7 victims. She photographed the markings from multiple angles, recognizing some symbols from cases involving cult activity but finding others completely unfamiliar. Detective, one of the uniformed officers was at the warehouse entrance gesturing urgently. "There's someone here claiming responsibility. Says he wants to talk only to you." The man waiting in the back of a patrol car looked utterly ordinary. Caucasian, mid-40s, slightly overweight, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that could have been purchased at any department store. He had the kind of face that would be impossible to describe in any distinctive way. Average features, no memorable characteristics, the human equivalent of beige. But his eyes held something that made Sarah's instincts flare with warning. A calm certainty, a complete absence of fear or doubt. "Detective Vance," he said pleasantly when she opened the car door. "Thank you for coming. My name is David Keller, and I'd like to confess to 7 murders." Sarah recorded the conversation, following protocol, even though every instinct screamed that this situation existed outside normal investigative frameworks. "Mr. Keller, before we proceed, I need to inform you of your rights." He waved this away with a slight smile. "I waive all rights, Detective. I want to talk. I want you to understand what I've done and why. Otherwise, it's all meaningless. Why don't you tell me about the 7 people inside the warehouse?" "They volunteered," Keller said, and his tone suggested he was stating simple fact, rather than making an outlandish claim. "I placed advertisements online 6 months ago, very specific solicitations seeking individuals who wanted to participate in a meaningful experiment. I was transparent about the risks, about the likely outcome, about the nature of what we would attempt together. 23 people responded. After extensive vetting and conversation, 7 were selected. Selected for what? To test a hypothesis about consciousness and death. You see, Detective, I believe that human awareness continues after bodily death, but in a different form, a different frequency. What we call death is simply a transition, a change in how consciousness experiences reality. But transitions require catalysts, and traditional dying is too random, too chaotic to produce useful data. So I developed a method." Sarah's skin crawled as she listened to him speak, his calm, academic tone discussing murder as if it were a scientific procedure. "What method?" "A carefully calibrated combination of drugs and psychological preparation. The 7 individuals you found underwent 3 months of intensive mental training, learning to maintain conscious awareness during altered states. Then tonight, they gathered voluntarily, took the compounds I'd prepared, and followed the protocol we developed together. They died peacefully, willingly, in pursuit of knowledge about what comes next. That's still murder, Mr. Keller. Assisted suicide at minimum, mass murder more likely. I'm not disputing legal categorization, Detective. I'm explaining context. Those 7 people believed they were participating in important research. They documented their experiences leading up to tonight, kept journals describing their mental states, their fears, their hopes about what they might discover. They weren't victims. They were co-investigators. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from the crime scene team. The bodies had been identified. 7 Portland residents who'd gone missing over the past week, all last seen withdrawing their life savings from bank accounts and canceling their leases or obligations. They'd prepared for this, had voluntarily severed their connections to normal life before gathering in the warehouse for what Keller described as an experiment, but which Sarah knew was simply mass murder dressed up in pseudo-intellectual justification. "You killed 7 people," she said flatly. Whatever story you're telling yourself about experiments and volunteers, you ended 7 lives. I facilitated their transition, Keller corrected. And the experiment isn't over. You see, the real test begins now, after their physical deaths. I've been monitoring subtle changes in electromagnetic fields, temperature fluctuations, localized distortions in what we might call the fabric of reality. If consciousness persists after death, it should produce measurable effects. The 7 participants agreed to try to communicate, to send signals from whatever state they currently occupy. I need time to collect that data. You're insane. That's what everyone says when confronted with ideas that challenge comfortable assumptions. But I'm not insane, Detective. I'm simply willing to ask questions that others find uncomfortable, willing to pursue answers through methods that society has deemed unacceptable. History is full of researchers who were dismissed as mad until their work was validated. I'm simply the latest in that tradition. Sarah arrested David Keller, charged him with 7 counts of murder, and watched as he was processed through the system with the same disturbing calm he displayed throughout their conversation. He never resisted, never complained, never showed any emotion beyond that slight smile and the unwavering certainty in his eyes. The investigation revealed that Keller had been planning this for years. His apartment contained journals documenting his theoretical framework for consciousness transition, research materials about near-death experiences, and extensive files on each of his 7 victims, though he insisted on calling them participants. He'd selected people who'd suffered significant losses or life disruptions, individuals who were vulnerable to his promises of meaning and discovery beyond death. The trial was swift. Keller pled guilty to all charges, refused to allow his attorney to pursue an insanity defense, and used his sentencing hearing to deliver a 40-minute lecture about his theories. The judge, visibly disturbed, sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. 7 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each person he'd killed. But the story didn't end there, because 3 weeks after Keller's conviction, strange things began happening at the warehouse. The building had been sealed as a crime scene, slated for demolition once the legal proceedings concluded. But security guards reported unusual activity, lights in windows of a building with no power, sounds of voices in rooms they'd confirmed were empty. Temperature dropped so severe that frost formed on windows despite the warm September weather. Sarah didn't believe in ghosts. She'd investigated too many supposedly supernatural occurrences that turned out to have prosaic explanations. But she agreed to visit the warehouse with a team of technicians, if only to document the mundane causes of the reported phenomena so the guards would stop filing anxious reports. What they found defied explanation. The chalk markings on the floor where the 7 bodies had been discovered were glowing faintly, emitting a phosphorescent light that had no identifiable source. Electromagnetic field detectors showed readings that fluctuated wildly, spiking in patterns that one of the technicians described as almost like communication attempts, like someone tapping out messages in a language we don't understand. Temperature sensors documented cold spots that moved through the space with seeming intelligence, clustering around the locations where each body had been seated. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah said, watching the instruments register impossible data. "There has to be a rational explanation." "Maybe Keller was right," one of the technicians suggested quietly. "Maybe consciousness does persist. Maybe those 7 people are still here in some form, trying to communicate." The possibility was horrifying, Not because Sarah disbelieved in life after death. She'd been raised Catholic, retained a vague faith in continuation, but because it suggested Keller's murders had achieved their goal. He'd killed 7 people, and in doing so had somehow proven his obscene hypothesis correct. The dead weren't gone. They were trapped, transformed, existing in a state that could be measured but not understood. Sarah visited Keller in prison, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps she needed to see his face when she told him about the warehouse, about the data that seemed to support his claims. Perhaps she wanted to watch that calm certainty crack when confronted with the human cost of his intellectual curiosity. "Detective Vance," Keller greeted her with genuine warmth. "I'm delighted you've come. I assume you have news about the research. The warehouse is showing unusual activity. Electromagnetic fluctuations, temperature anomalies, things that shouldn't be happening in a sealed, empty building." His smile widened. "They're trying to communicate. I knew they would be. Are you documenting it properly? The data could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness." "You killed 7 people," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "And now they're trapped in some liminal state, unable to move on or find peace. You didn't facilitate a transition, Keller. You tortured them. You condemned them to an existence that's neither life nor death." For the first time, something flickered behind Keller's calm expression. Not guilt or remorse, but something closer to doubt. "They volunteered," he repeated, but with less certainty than before. "They trusted you. They believed your promises about meaningful research and discovery. But you didn't tell them what the cost would be, did you? You didn't explain that consciousness persistence might mean eternal awareness without body or agency. Trapped in a single location, unable to move forward or back. That's not transition. That's imprisonment." Sarah left him there, sitting in his cell with his certainty finally cracking. She didn't know if she'd reached him, if her words had penetrated the intellectual framework he'd constructed to justify atrocity. But she hoped they had. Hoped he'd spend the rest of his life contemplating what he'd done to 7 people who'd trusted him. The warehouse was eventually demolished, though Sarah fought to delay it. If the 7 victims were somehow still present in that space, destroying the building might trap them further or disperse their consciousness into the earth. But the city's legal team overruled her concerns. They couldn't preserve a building indefinitely based on paranormal speculation, no matter how compelling the documented anomalies. On the day of demolition, Sarah stood across the street and watched the old structure come down. As the walls crumbled and the roof collapsed, she thought she saw lights in the falling dust, 7 distinct points of luminescence rising upward before dispersing into the afternoon sky. The technician's instruments registered one final spike in electromagnetic activity, then went silent. She hoped that was the end. She hoped the 7 victims had finally been released, allowed to move on to whatever comes next. But she couldn't be certain, and the uncertainty haunted her more than any crime scene photograph ever had. Because David Keller had been right about one thing: death wasn't the end of consciousness, or at least not always. Sometimes it was a transformation into something else, something we had no language for, and no tools to understand. And sometimes, Sarah thought as she drove away from the demolished warehouse, the worst crimes aren't the ones that end lives, but the ones that prevent death from bringing the peace it should. The victims Keller claimed to have liberated had instead been trapped, imprisoned in a state between life and death, paying eternally for his intellectual curiosity and their misplaced trust. Justice had been served in legal terms. Keller would spend the rest of his life in prison. But for his 7 victims, justice remained elusive, complicated by the possibility that their suffering continued in forms the living couldn't perceive or prevent. And that, Sarah realized, was the most haunting aspect of the case. Not the murders themselves, but the terrible question of whether those murders had truly ended or simply changed form, transforming victims from living people into eternal prisoners trapped in states we had no power to free them from. Story 5. The inheritance was unexpected. Claire hadn't spoken to her Aunt Miriam in over a decade, hadn't known the elderly woman was ill, and certainly hadn't anticipated being named sole beneficiary of the woman's modest estate. The lawyer's letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, informing her that she'd inherited Miriam's house in coastal Oregon, a 3-bedroom cottage on 2 acres overlooking the Pacific, property valued at just under $1 million based on current real estate assessments. There are conditions, the lawyer, a tired-sounding man named Brennan, explained over the phone. Your aunt specified that you must live in the house for a minimum of 1 year before selling. She was quite adamant about this. If you sell before the year is complete, the property reverts to a conservation trust. Claire lived in a cramped studio apartment in Seattle, worked 60-hour weeks at a job she tolerated rather than loved, and had no ties keeping her in the city. Moving to rural Oregon for a year seemed not just feasible, but potentially restorative. She gave notice at her job, packed her possessions into a rental truck, and drove south on a rainy April morning, ready to begin what she imagined would be a peaceful interlude before selling the property and using the proceeds to build whatever life she chose next. The house was beautiful, exactly the kind of character-rich older home that developers would immediately tear down to build something modern and soulless. It had been constructed in the 1920s, added onto over decades, creating an organic sprawl of connected rooms that felt more like a living thing than architecture. Large windows provided views of the ocean, and the lot included mature pine trees that whispered constantly in the coastal wind. Claire spent her first week cleaning and organizing, learning the house's particular quirks and rhythms. She discovered that the 3rd bedroom was unbearably cold regardless of how high she turned the heat, that the floorboards in the hallway creaked in a specific pattern that sounded almost like footsteps, and that certain windows would open on their own despite being securely latched. Old houses had personalities, she told herself. These were just the normal eccentricities of a structure built nearly a century ago. But then she found the journals. They were in the attic, packed in a wooden crate alongside photo albums and letters spanning decades of Miriam's life. Claire hadn't planned to read them. Diaries felt too private, too much like violating the dead woman's interior life. But the most recent journal was sitting on top of the crate, open to its final entry, dated 3 days before Miriam's death. If you're reading this, Claire, it means you've accepted the house. I'm sorry to burden you with this knowledge, but you need to understand what you've inherited. The house is occupied by more than just me. There's something here. Something that's been here since before I moved in 43 years ago. I've tried to understand it, tried to coexist with it, but I'm old now and tired, and I need you to decide what to do with this situation because I no longer have the strength or clarity to manage it. Claire's hands trembled as she turned back through earlier entries, finding references scattered across months and years. Miriam described doors that opened themselves, objects that moved overnight, sounds of crying that seemed to come from the walls themselves. she'd researched the house's history, discovering that it had been built by a family named Morrison who'd lost their daughter, a girl of 7 named Rebecca, to scarlet fever in 1926. The child had died in what was now the freezing third bedroom, the one Claire couldn't seem to heat no matter how she adjusted the thermostat. "I've seen her," Miriam wrote in an entry from 1998. "Not clearly, she's more suggestion than substance, a shimmer in peripheral vision that disappears when I look directly. But I know she's Rebecca Morrison. She's still here, still in the house where she died, unable or unwilling to move on. I've tried to communicate, to offer comfort, but she's afraid, or angry, or simply lonely. I can't tell which." Claire set the journal aside, trying to process this information rationally. Her aunt had been elderly, possibly suffering from dementia or other cognitive decline. The journals might document hallucinations rather than genuine supernatural encounters. But even as she constructed these explanations, she remembered the cold bedroom, the self-opening windows, the footstep-like creaking. Details she dismissed as ordinary housework suddenly took on different significance. That night, Claire woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of crying. It was soft, muffled, the sound of a child trying to weep quietly so adults wouldn't hear. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the walls and the air itself. She lay frozen in bed, telling herself she was dreaming, that the sound was wind or plumbing or her imagination. But the crying continued for nearly 10 minutes before fading to silence. In the morning, she found the third bedroom door standing open despite having closed and locked it before bed. Inside, the temperature was even colder than usual, cold enough that her breath misted in the air. Frost had formed on the inside of the windows in patterns that looked almost like handprints. Small handprints, child-sized, pressed against the glass from the interior, as if someone had been looking out at the world beyond. Claire called the lawyer. "Mr. Brennan, did my aunt mention anything unusual about the house? Anything I should know beyond the standard property disclosures?" There was a long pause. "She mentioned that it had a unique atmosphere. Said you'd understand what that meant once you'd lived there a while. But she was insistent that you needed to experience the house yourself. Said that telling you beforehand would bias your perception." "I'm sorry, Ms. Chen. I realize that's cryptic. Did she believe the house was haunted?" "She never used that word, but she did say the house needed someone who would treat its occupants with respect and care. Occupants plural. I assumed she meant potential tenants if you chose to rent the property out. Now I'm wondering if she meant something else." After hanging up, Claire returned to the attic and read through Miriam's journals methodically, looking for patterns and guidance. Her aunt had documented 43 years of cohabitation with something supernatural, learning its habits and preferences through patient observation. Rebecca, if that's who the presence was, seemed most active in the early morning hours, between 3 and 4 a.m. She gravitated toward the third bedroom, the place of her death, but sometimes appeared in other parts of the house. She responded to gentle speech and seemed calmer when Claire spoke aloud about her daily activities, as if conversation soothed her loneliness. "I've come to think of her as family," Miriam wrote in 2015. "She's been here longer than I have, after all. This is her home more than it ever was mine. I'm just a temporary resident in a house that will outlive me and continue sheltering Rebecca long after I'm gone. I hope whoever inherits this place will understand that. She's not a problem to be solved or an infestation to be removed. She's a child who died too young and deserves compassion, not fear or rejection." Claire began talking to the empty house, narrating her activities the way Miriam's journals suggested. "I'm making coffee now, Rebecca. It's a beautiful morning. You should see the way the sunlight hits the ocean. I'm going to work in the garden today. Try to clear some of the overgrowth. Your mother probably planted some of these roses. They're very old." She didn't expect responses, but small things changed. The third bedroom grew slightly warmer, as if her acknowledgement had eased whatever kept it cold. The self-opening windows stopped, replaced by a new pattern. She'd find them open in the mornings, as if Rebecca had been looking out at the dawn. Objects moved occasionally, but deliberately now, rearranged rather than disturbed. A book Claire left on the coffee table would appear on a different shelf. A hairbrush moved from bathroom to bedroom. Not chaotic, but communicative, as if someone was learning to interact through careful manipulation of physical space. 3 months into her residency, Claire woke at 3:17 a.m. to find a child standing at the foot of her bed. Not a solid figure, but a suggestion of one, a shimmer in the darkness that held the shape of a small girl in old-fashioned nightclothes. Claire's first instinct was terror, her heart rate spiking, her body preparing to flee. But she forced herself to stillness, remembering Miriam's words about respect and compassion. "Hello, Rebecca," she whispered. "You don't have to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you or make you leave. This is your home." The shimmer didn't respond in any conventional way. No words, no gestures. But the quality of the silence changed, becoming less tense, more contemplative. After perhaps a minute, the figure faded, dissolving like mist when dawn arrives. But before it completely disappeared, Claire felt a sensation of warmth on her forehead, as if small, cold fingers had touched her gently, offering what might have been gratitude or recognition, or simply acknowledgement of the connection forming between them. Claire stayed in the house for the required year, then declined to sell. She got a remote job working in data analysis, found community in the small coastal town, and learned to share her home with its permanent resident. Rebecca's presence became familiar, comforting even, a child who died nearly a century ago, but who remained tethered to the place and people she'd loved, unable or unwilling to move beyond the threshold between life and death. Sometimes Claire wondered if she should try to help Rebecca cross over, to facilitate whatever transition death was supposed to bring. She researched mediums and spiritual practices, considered calling in people who claimed expertise in such matters. But always, she returned to Miriam's core insight. Rebecca wasn't a problem requiring solution. She was simply a child living in a different way than most, deserving respect and companionship rather than exorcism or intervention. Years passed. Claire grew older in the house by the sea, her life settling into rhythms that accommodated both the living and the dead. She eventually met someone, a woman named Sarah, who accepted with surprising equanimity the news that her partner shared her home with a ghost. "My grandmother used to say that love is stronger than death," Sarah said when Claire finally worked up the courage to explain Rebecca's presence. "Maybe that's what keeps her here. Love for this place, for the people in it. That's not something to be afraid of." On Claire's 10th anniversary in the house, she woke at 3:17 a.m. and found Rebecca standing at the window, more visible than she'd ever been. The child was looking out at the ocean, her posture wistful, and for the first time Claire could see her face clearly. A 7-year-old with delicate features and eyes that held impossible depths of time and loss. "Do you want to leave?" Claire asked softly. "I've kept you here, haven't I? Made you feel like you needed to stay." to take care of me the way Miriam took care of you. But you don't have to stay, sweetheart. If you're ready to go, if you want to see what comes next, I'll be okay. The house will be okay." Rebecca turned from the window and looked at Claire with those ancient young eyes. And then, for the first time in 97 years, she spoke. Her voice was tiny, nearly inaudible, but unmistakably real. Stay. Just that one word, but it contained everything, choice and agency, and the simple desire to remain in the place that had become not a prison, but a home. She wasn't trapped by death or unfinished business. She was choosing to stay, finding comfort and continuity in the house that had witnessed her entire brief life, and all the years since. "Then I'll stay too," Claire said, "for as long as you want me here." Rebecca smiled, a quick flash of expression that transformed her solemn face into something joyful, before fading back into shimmer and then to nothing. But the bedroom felt warmer, the house more settled, as if something had been resolved not through ending but through mutual understanding and acceptance. Claire never sold the house. When she died 40 years later, peacefully in her sleep at age 83, she left the property to a young woman she'd mentored. Someone who'd understand about Rebecca, who'd continue the tradition of respectful cohabitation. The house passed down through the generations that way, always to people who'd honor its unique occupant, who'd understand that haunting wasn't always horror, that sometimes the dead remained, not because they were lost, but because they'd found exactly where they belonged. And Rebecca stayed in the house she'd known since 1919, watching over the inhabitants who loved her, keeping vigil at windows overlooking the sea, remaining tethered to life not through tragedy but through choice. A child who'd learned that home wasn't about being alive or dead, but about being loved and remembered, and allowed to exist in whatever form existence took. The living came and went. Rebecca remained, and in remaining she taught everyone who shared her house that love indeed persists beyond death, that connection transcends transition, and that home, once found, is a place we never truly have to leave. Story 6. The letter arrived 6 months after Marcus disappeared. His sister Emma found it in her mailbox on a Thursday morning in October, addressed in handwriting she'd recognize anywhere despite not having seen it in years. Marcus's distinctive script, precise, slightly theatrical, each letter carefully formed as if he'd never outgrown the penmanship drills of childhood. The postmark was illegible, deliberately smudged. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper stock, sealed with actual wax that bore an impression Emma couldn't quite identify. She opened it standing at her kitchen counter, coffee growing cold beside her. October rain hammering against the windows. "Dear Emma, if you're reading this, I've been gone for at least 6 months. I need you to understand that my disappearance was intentional, necessary, and this is the part you'll find hardest to accept. Voluntary. I haven't been abducted. I'm not being held against my will. I left because I discovered something that required leaving. Something I can't fully explain but will attempt to anyway. Because you deserve more than silence and uncertainty. Do you remember the antique compass I found at that estate sale in 2018? The brass one with the strange engravings that the seller couldn't identify. I've been studying those symbols for the past 3 years, slowly decoding what I initially thought was decorative nonsense. It isn't nonsense, Em. It's a map, or more precisely, instructions for finding a place that exists adjacent to our reality, not separate from it, but overlapping it in ways that standard geography can't account for. Emma's hands began to tremble. Marcus had always been interested in strange things, ancient languages, occult symbolism, conspiracy theories that danced along the border between fascinating and ridiculous. But he'd been brilliant, holding advanced degrees in linguistics and anthropology, teaching at the university level before his sabbatical 2 years ago. This letter sounded like him and not like him simultaneously, as if his voice had been filtered through experiences that changed its fundamental frequency. I found the place, Emma. I followed the compass's instructions, performing rituals that felt absurd, even as I executed them. And I found the threshold the symbols described. I can't tell you where it is geographically. The location shifts, or perhaps I was never meant to remember how to return to it from this side. But I crossed over. I walked through what appeared to be empty air and found myself somewhere else. Somewhere else isn't quite accurate. It's more like everywhere else simultaneously. A place where all the discarded possibilities of our reality collect and cohere. Every decision ever made creates branches, paths not taken, that don't simply cease to exist but continue in diminished form. Shadows of what might have been. That's where I am now, living in the spaces between choices, exploring the versions of reality that almost existed but didn't quite. Emma set the letter down, trying to process what she was reading. Her brother had been missing for 6 months. The police investigation had found no evidence of foul play, no financial irregularities suggesting he'd planned to flee, no communications indicating distress or intention to vanish. He'd simply walked out of his apartment one March morning and never returned. Security footage showed him walking down the street with nothing but a shoulder bag, looking calm and purposeful. Then he turned a corner and vanished from every camera, every witness account, every possible means of tracking. She picked up the letter again, compelled to read further despite, or perhaps because of, its complete detachment from reasonable explanation. There are others here, Emma. Not many, but enough that I don't feel entirely alone. People who found their own ways across, following their own maps or stumbling through accidental thresholds during moments of extreme stress or altered consciousness. We've formed a sort of community, though community implies more structure than actually exists. We're travelers in a landscape that doesn't follow normal rules, finding each other through mechanisms I still don't fully understand. Time works differently here. I've been here for what feels like 3 years, but if you're reading this 6 months after I left, then my perception is clearly not calibrated to your reality's clock. That discrepancy bothers me less than you'd imagine. I've learned to accept that certainty about time, location, causation was always an illusion anyway. We just agreed collectively to pretend otherwise so we could function. I'm not coming back, Em. I need you to understand that. This isn't a kidnapping, isn't a breakdown, isn't anything that requires rescue or intervention. I chose this. I continue to choose it every day. Though day isn't quite the right word for the temporal units we experience here. I chose it because this place asks questions our reality refuses to consider, shows me possibilities our world dismissed before they could fully form. Emma's vision blurred with tears. She wanted to dismiss the letter as evidence of psychotic break, as confirmation that Marcus had experienced some catastrophic mental health crisis that had driven him into delusion. But the letter's lucidity troubled her. His voice came through clearly, rationally, explaining something impossible with the same measured logic he'd always brought to complex topics. He wasn't raving. He was teaching, translating an experience that transcended normal vocabulary. I imagine you'll show this letter to authorities, to doctors, to people who will analyze it for clues about my whereabouts or state of mind. They won't find anything useful. The compass is gone. I brought it with me, not to prevent others from following, but because it felt wrong to leave it behind. If there were a way to bring you here, to show you what I'm experiencing, I would. But the thresholds are personal, unique to each traveler. You'd need to find your own way, and I'm not certain you'd want to, even if you could. I'm writing to say goodbye and to say thank you. Thank you for believing me when I talked about impossibilities, for indulging my obsessions with ancient symbols and lost knowledge, for never dismissing me as eccentric or broken. I was searching for this my entire life, without knowing it existed. And now that I've found it, I can't pretend that ordinary reality, your reality, is sufficient anymore. Live well, Em. Don't grieve for me. I'm not gone. I'm just elsewhere, exploring territories that most people will never know exist. That's always been what I wanted. I've just finally found the place where that wanting can be satisfied. Your brother, Marcus Emma, reread the letter 3 times, then called Detective Martinez, the investigator assigned to Marcus's case. She handed over the letter, watched Martinez's expression shift from interest to confusion, to something that might have been pity. Ms. Chen, I think we need to consider the possibility that your brother was experiencing significant mental health issues before his disappearance. This letter suggests paranoid delusions, possibly schizophrenia spectrum disorder. He's a professor of linguistics, Emma said, hearing the defensiveness in her own voice. He has a PhD. He's published. This isn't incoherent rambling. It's describing something specific. Something impossible, Martinez said gently. A place that exists adjacent to reality. Instructions hidden in antique compasses. Thresholds to other dimensions. These are the exact kinds of delusional frameworks we see in certain mental illnesses. Your brother may have believed what he wrote, but that doesn't make it real. Emma wanted to argue, but found herself without language for what she wanted to defend. Of course, the letter described impossibilities. Of course, Marcus sounded delusional, but she'd known her brother for 43 years. She'd seen him excited, and obsessed, and frustrated, and determined. She'd never seen him lose touch with reality in ways that suggested psychiatric crisis. He'd been strange, yes, but coherently strange. His interests peculiar, but pursued with rigorous methodology. The investigation continued, but produced nothing new. The letter was filed as evidence, analyzed by forensic document examiners and psychological profilers. Everyone agreed Marcus had written it. No one believed the content represented anything but delusion. The case remained open but grew cold, joining thousands of others where someone had simply vanished, leaving behind questions without answers. Emma kept a copy of the letter. She read it periodically over the following years, trying to extract meaning beyond the obvious interpretation of mental breakdown. Marcus had been specific about certain things. The compass, the symbols, the estate sale. She traced the purchase back, found the seller, discovered that the compass had been part of a larger collection inherited from someone who'd spent decades studying what they'd called liminal cartography. The seller knew nothing about the compass's significance, but confirmed that Marcus had been fascinated by it, had asked detailed questions about its origin and history. Emma began her own research, chasing the same threads Marcus must have followed. She learned about threshold spaces in folklore, about in-between places that existed in cultural imagination, if not in physical geography. She discovered online communities dedicated to documenting reality glitches, moments when the ordinary world seemed to slip, revealing something else underneath. She read testimonials from people who claimed to have visited impossible places, experienced impossible things, returned changed in ways they couldn't adequately describe. And slowly, reluctantly, she began to consider the possibility that Marcus had been telling the truth. Not literal truth in the sense that his letter could be verified by empirical investigation, but truth of experience, truth of lived reality that transcended what society agreed was possible. Perhaps there were places, states, experiences that existed despite our collective insistence they didn't. Perhaps the world was larger and stranger than our comfortable certainties allowed. Emma never found her own threshold. She searched, following Marcus's footsteps as far as they could be traced, but whatever door he'd discovered remained closed to her. Maybe she didn't want it badly enough. Maybe her threshold was different, would reveal itself only when she stopped actively seeking, or maybe some doors open only once for specific people at specific moments, and Marcus's journey was his alone. She never stopped wondering, but eventually, she stopped grieving, because the letter, whatever else it was, communicated one thing clearly. Marcus was happy. He'd found what he'd spent his life seeking. He'd walked through a door most people never knew existed and discovered territories that satisfied his deepest curiosities. That wasn't tragedy. That was fulfillment. The world was large and strange and full of possibilities our limited perceptions couldn't fully grasp. Emma understood that now, and somewhere in a place adjacent to here, in a space between choices, her brother was exploring impossibilities and sending back messages that said, "There's more than you know. Don't stop wondering. Don't stop looking. The world is stranger and more beautiful than they tell you." And that, Emma thought, as rain continued to fall outside her window, was perhaps all anyone could hope for. To find the strange beauty that called to them specifically, to follow it beyond the boundaries of ordinary life, and to live in the spaces where wonder still existed. Marcus had found his space, and though she missed him, she couldn't mourn someone who'd gotten exactly what he wanted. The letter stayed in her desk drawer, a reminder that disappearance wasn't always loss, that some journeys led to destinations beyond mapping, and that the world contained doors for those brave, or desperate, or curious enough to walk through them. She didn't know if she'd ever find her own door, but she kept looking, kept wondering, kept living with the knowledge that her brother had taught her the most important lesson. Ordinary reality was just one option among many, and choosing otherwise wasn't madness, but courage. And with that, my friends, we come to the end of our time together tonight. I hope these stories gave you what you came looking for, that perfect mix of unease and wonder, those questions that linger after the telling is done. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the shadows. It means more than you know to have your company in the darkness. Before you drift off to sleep, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoyed these tales. And I'm still curious. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how our community spans across the world. Until tomorrow night, sleep well, dream peacefully, and remember that the stories we tell in darkness can't hurt you. They're just whispers in the night, shadows on the wall, echoes of fears we all share. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you again soon.